German tanks in one afternoon did not begin as a tale of miraculous heroism, but as a quiet episode buried in the confusion of the Italian campaign in 1944. It started months earlier, in a workshop improvised from the shell of a collapsed farmhouse outside Bari. There, a young Polish engineer named Jan Kowalski recently escaped from occupied Warsaw and absorbed into a mixed Allied sapper detachment, spent long evenings bending scavenged metal, filing down fragments of captured German equipment, and sketching diagrams by lantern light. The shortages facing smaller Allied units in the theater were severe. Standard anti-tank guns were assigned to higher priority divisions, and portable launchers were rarely available in enough numbers. Kowalski, trained before the war in basic mechanical engineering, believed that a simple shaped charge launcher could be built with whatever parts the unit could salvage from abandoned positions, destroyed vehicles, and damaged supply crates. His earliest prototypes were crude, lengths of steel tubing, mismatched brackets, and fragments of mortar stands hammered back into alignment. The firing mechanism relied on a spring-loaded striker assembly taken from a broken flare gun. The stability braces were fashioned from bicycle frames pulled from the rubble of nearby bombed-out streets. When he first presented the device to his commanding officer, the reactions ranged from amusement to open skepticism. The launcher looked fragile, asymmetrical, and barely reliable enough for training use, let alone combat. Soldiers joked that it might fall apart before the first shot, or worse, explode in the operator's hands. Yet to Kowalski, the contraption represented not desperation, but possibility, a tool that could give under-equipped infantry a chance to slow down German armored patrols in the hilly, fragmented terrain of central Italy. Over the following weeks, the workshop became a gathering point for men curious enough to help refine the design. Spare metal was straightened and reforged over makeshift furnaces. Tests were carried out in a dry ravine, where the team fired inert rounds to measure stability and recoil. The shaped charge warheads, constructed with guidance from technicians who had studied captured German Panzerfausts, were tested against derelict vehicle hulls. To the surprise of many who dismissed the project at first glance, the warheads achieved clean penetrations through side armor plates at close range. The main limitation was obvious: the launcher was effective only at very short distances, and its accuracy relied heavily on the operator's ability to predict tank movement in difficult terrain. But the possibility of fielding even a handful of these devices offered frontline units a measure of flexibility they had lacked. By March 1944, Kowalski had completed 3 working models. They were heavy, awkward, and required at least 2 soldiers to operate efficiently, but they functioned reliably in controlled tests. The final design included a sighting rail welded from spare iron strips, reinforced grips wrapped in cloth to reduce vibration, and a redesigned firing assembly that significantly lowered misfire risk. Reports about the unusual weapon began to circulate informally between companies, usually framed as a curious experiment rather than a serious battlefield asset. Some officers saw no practical use for it. Others, particularly those responsible for holding narrow mountain passes or defending isolated positions, quietly requested additional demonstrations. No one imagined that this improvised launcher, built from fragments of scrap, bicycle metal, and battlefield debris, would soon play a part in one of the most heavily mythologized defensive actions of the Italian front. The exaggerations that later turned it into a legend would overshadow the reality, but the truth, though less sensational, provides a clearer window into the resourcefulness and desperation that shaped the war's lesser-known battles. The battle that transformed Kowalski's improvised launcher from a curiosity into a headline began on the morning of 18 May 1944 in the hills overlooking the village of Montorio. The region's terrain created natural choke points, narrow terraces cut into the slopes, stone walls built generations earlier, and winding mule paths barely wide enough for a single vehicle. For months, Allied units had struggled to advance against well-prepared German defenses. The Germans, withdrawing slowly northward, often counterattacked with small armored groups to disrupt supply lines and delay infantry movement. On that particular morning, they launched one such action, an armored thrust intended to retake a ridge that offered commanding views of the valley road below. Kowalski's sapper detachment had been attached to a British infantry company tasked with reinforcing the ridge. They arrived before sunrise, digging shallow firing positions among olive trees and collapsed terraces. Their equipment was meager: a few rifles, limited explosives, and the three improvised launchers that had been hauled up the slope with considerable effort. The men knew they were unlikely to face a full armored battalion. Intelligence suggested a mixed force of Panzer IVs, StuG 3rd assault guns, and half-tracks. Still, even a handful of armored vehicles could break through lightly defended lines, especially in terrain where repositioning heavy Allied anti-tank guns was nearly impossible. By mid-morning, the distant sound of engines echoed across the valley. Dust rose in a wide plume as German armor advanced cautiously up the narrow approach road. The first shells landed minutes later, crashing into the ridge with bursts of earth and shattered stone. Infantry scattered to prepared positions, and radio operators called frantically for artillery support. Visibility dropped as smoke drifted between the terraces. The defenders could see the silhouettes of German vehicles edging forward, their guns searching for movement along the slopes. Kowalski and his team positioned themselves behind a collapsed stone barn that overlooked one of the narrowest bends in the approach road. From this angle, the German tanks would be forced to expose their side armor, thinly protected compared to the heavily reinforced fronts. It was exactly the type of terrain for which the improvised launcher had been conceived. But the risks were enormous. The weapon had an effective range of only a few dozen meters, meaning the operators had to wait until the tanks were almost directly beside them. Any misjudgment could be fatal. The first Panzer IV appeared in the gap between smoke clouds, grinding forward over loose stones. Its turret rotated slowly toward suspected Allied positions farther up the ridge. Kowalski steadied the launcher while his assistant armed the warhead. They waited, crouching behind the remains of a wall so weathered that pieces flaked off under their hands. When the tank's flank came fully into view, Kowalski exhaled, lifted the launcher into place, and fired. The shaped charge projectile struck the side armor just behind the turret ring. A sharp flash followed by a column of gray smoke signaled a penetration. The tank jerked to a halt. Almost immediately, the narrow road bottlenecked, forcing the vehicles behind it to stop or attempt to reverse in the confined space. Confusion spread through the German formation. The second and third vehicles tried to maneuver, scraping against the stone terrace walls, their engines revving under strain. The defenders used the moment. Allied rifle grenadiers targeted exposed infantry. Artillery, finally zeroed in, dropped shells near the rear of the German column. Amid the chaos, Kowalski's team repositioned to a new angle, dragging the heavy launcher over fallen beams. They fired again when a StuG 3 attempted to push past the disabled tank. The projectile struck low near the suspension. Flames rose from beneath the vehicle, and it slid sideways, blocking even more of the narrow path. Throughout the afternoon, the battle intensified. Each firing position required relocation after a shot, both to avoid detection and to take advantage of the terrain. The German attack stalled repeatedly as vehicles were disabled or forced to retreat down the cramped road. The improvised launchers were not the decisive factor on their own, but they contributed significantly in key moments, disrupting the advance, damaging vehicles at close range, and forcing the armored column into a confined space where artillery could do the rest. By dusk, the ridge remained in Allied hands. The German counterattack had been repelled after hours of close-quarter fighting, smoke, confusion, and improvised tactics. In the initial reports filed that night, Kowalski's team recorded 2 confirmed kills and 1 immobilization. But as word spread and morale-boosting summaries traveled upward through command channels, the numbers began to grow, setting the stage for the legend that would follow. By the time the first official summaries of the Montorio engagement reached divisional headquarters, the facts had already begun to drift. The chaos of the battle, the limited visibility, and the difficulty of confirming which weapon had struck which German vehicle created a fertile environment for exaggeration. Infantrymen who had witnessed only fragments of the fight filled gaps in their memory with assumption and rumor. Some believed the improvised launcher had been deployed in larger numbers than it actually had. Others assumed any tank disabled on the narrow road must have been struck by Kowalski's contraption, simply because its smoke trails were the most dramatic and unfamiliar on the battlefield. Within 2 days, a draft newsletter intended for Allied troops mentioned that a Polish sapper detachment repelled an entire armored thrust with a handful of experimental anti-tank launchers. Another informal dispatch, circulated among British units engaged in the same sector, suggested that up to a dozen enemy armored vehicles were destroyed or disabled by close-range fire from improvised weapons. These early retellings still bore some resemblance to documented events, but they hinted at a trend. Every recounting amplified the role of the launchers, overshadowing the crucial involvement of artillery, mines, and machine gun positions. Meanwhile, Kowalski and the men in his detachment remained on the ridge, reorganizing equipment and clearing debris. They were unaware of the growing legend until a war correspondent arrived 2 days later. The correspondent had heard from passing soldiers that a scrap metal launcher had brought an armored column to a standstill. By the time he climbed the ridge, the story had already inflated. He asked the same question several times. Was it true that these homemade weapons had stopped more than 30 tanks in under an hour? The soldiers laughed, surprised at the scale of the rumor, but the correspondent, pressed for time and eager for a morale-boosting article, focused on the most dramatic elements they described: the close-range firing, the smoke-filled terraces, the sudden immobilization of German vehicles in the choke point. The resulting article blended fact and conjecture. It praised Kowalski as a young engineer who turned battlefield scrap into a weapon of uncanny effectiveness. It described the narrow road, the flanking angles, and the smoke drifting over the hillside, all with considerable accuracy. But it also implied that every disabled vehicle on the slope had fallen to the improvised launcher, and that Kowalski's team had single-handedly halted a German armored company. The number 37 appeared not as a confirmed statistic, but as an estimate passed down through several layers of hearsay. The article suggested heroism, ingenuity, and the triumph of resourcefulness over industrial force, ideas that fit perfectly into the morale campaign aimed at troops weary of static fighting and difficult terrain. The headline spread quickly. Allied newspapers picked it up, compressing the story further. Within a week, the nuanced report had been distilled into a single dramatic narrative: one improvised launcher, one Polish engineer, and 37 German tanks halted in a single afternoon. The number, though almost certainly exaggerated by a wide margin, resonated with the public. It symbolized defiance and creativity at a moment of widespread fatigue. Readers at home found hope in the idea that even the most under-equipped unit could change the course of a battle. Soldiers at the front found reassurance that ingenuity still had a place in a war increasingly defined by industrial scale. Kowalski himself reacted with unease when he finally read the published version. He insisted to officers and journalists that the story had distorted his team's role beyond recognition. He pointed out that artillery fire had destroyed several of the vehicles, mines laid earlier in the week had damaged others. Some had simply been abandoned when the road became impassable. His protests were noted, but rarely printed. The narrative had grown too quickly, and wartime communication tended to favor stories that inspired rather than complicated. Nevertheless, internal military records from the Montorio sector, preserved after the war, offer a clearer assessment. They confirm 3 armored vehicles disabled directly by the improvised launchers, 2 immobilized by near misses, and several more trapped by the resulting obstruction. These results were modest compared to the myth, but still impressive given the improvised nature of the weapon, the difficult terrain, and the uncertainty of the engagement. As the exaggerated accounts continued to circulate, the story of the scrap metal launcher entered the collective memory of the Italian campaign, not as a precise record of what had happened on the ridge, but as an example of how wartime rumor, limited visibility, and the appetite for morale-boosting headlines can transform a genuine tactical success into a legend that obscures the actual chain of events. As the story of Kowalski's improvised launcher continued to circulate through Allied newspapers and military broadcasts, it began to take on a symbolic weight that far exceeded the events on the ridge above Montorio. To home front audiences, weary of telegrams listing casualties and stalled offensives, the tale offered something rare, a moment of apparent simplicity, a single man, a handmade weapon, and a decisive triumph against German armor. Newspapers condensed the complexities of the battle into a short, uplifting narrative that readers could easily grasp. "Scrap metal defies Panzers," one headline declared. "Makeshift launcher halts steel giants," wrote another. Each retelling smoothed away details, ambiguities, and contradictions, replacing them with a polished story more suitable for public consumption. Inside the military, however, officers and intelligence analysts approached the event with greater caution. Several after-action reviews noted the difficulty of verifying kill counts during engagements fought in steep, fragmented terrain. Others questioned the practicality of deploying improvised launchers more broadly, given their limited range and the skill required to use them safely. Yet even these analyses acknowledged that Kowalski's team had demonstrated something valuable: the capacity of small units to adapt creatively under resource constraints. Engineers from nearby divisions visited the ridge after the battle to examine the remains of the disabled vehicles, studying the penetration points and the impact angles. Their observations helped refine the understanding of shaped charge behavior in close-range conditions, even if no one expected the improvised launcher itself to become a standardized weapon. Meanwhile, the war correspondents who had carried the story forward rarely revisited the site or sought deeper verification. The demands of wartime reporting, combined with censorship rules and the logistical challenges of traveling between sectors, encouraged rapid publication over accuracy. Once printed, the headline acquired a kind of inertia. Other newspapers repeated it, radio hosts referenced it, and cartoonists produced illustrations exaggerating the launcher into something resembling a fantastical cannon made of pipes and rivets. The real weapon, lopsided, heavy, and awkward to fire, bore little resemblance to the heroic renderings that circulated among the public. For the soldiers who had fought at Montorio, the growing legend created mixed emotions. Some felt pride that their overlooked battle had finally received attention. Others were uneasy, sensing that the simplified narrative erased the contributions of artillery crews, rifle companies, and medics who had endured hours of shelling and close-range combat. A British sergeant who had manned a machine gun position on the ridge later remarked in a letter home that the papers make it sound as though we watched a miracle machine clear the hillside, when the truth was sweat, confusion, and holding our breath every time one of those tanks edged closer. Kowalski himself became an unintended figure of fascination. Officers encouraged him to give short interviews to Allied press units, hoping to harness the morale boost without explicitly endorsing the exaggerated tank count. During these interviews, he remained consistent. He credited the terrain, teamwork, and the barrage of artillery that had boxed the German column into the narrow approach road. He emphasized the limitations of his launcher and warned against romanticizing it. But journalists, eager for a cleaner narrative, often omitted these clarifications. They preferred the image of the quiet engineer who had turned scavenged metal into a weapon capable of stopping an entire armored thrust. Behind the scenes, military historians assigned to document the Italian campaign began to gather reports, testimonies, and technical observations. Their notes reveal an awareness of how quickly battlefield events could be distorted by rumor, fragmented memory, and the emotional pressures of war. Several made explicit reference to the Montorio incident as an example of narrative inflation, a term used to describe how small successes could expand into legendary accounts when filtered through the needs of propaganda and morale. Yet despite the distortions, the core of the story remained compelling. A small team of under-equipped sappers had made a measurable, documented impact on a German armored advance using a device assembled from battlefield debris. This achievement, though far less dramatic than the headline suggested, resonated because it reflected a broader truth about the war. Ingenuity was often the difference between holding a position and losing it, between survival and defeat. In the uncertainty of the Italian front, where terrain, weather, and supply shortages shaped every engagement, the willingness to improvise could be as significant as any standardized piece of equipment. By late summer 1944, the legend had become firmly embedded in Allied consciousness. Soldiers repeated it to new arrivals. Civilians clipped the articles and kept them with other wartime stories. The exaggerated tank count 37 became a fixed number, repeated so often that many assumed it must have originated from official military documentation. In reality, it had come from an offhand remark in a journalist's notebook, repeated without verification. But once such a figure entered the flow of wartime information, it was nearly impossible to retract. The Montorio story, now transformed into a symbol rather than a report, would continue to evolve long after the battle itself faded from military memory. Only after the war would historians attempt to disentangle the original facts from the layers of embellishment that had accumulated around them. In the decades following the war, historians examining the Italian campaign encountered the Montorio story repeatedly, sometimes in footnotes, sometimes in memoirs, and often in sensationalized retellings that bore little resemblance to the documented events of May 1944. The legend had grown so entrenched that separating fact from fiction required careful comparison of operational records, interviews, and technical reports. What emerged from this work was not the tale of a miraculous weapon capable of single-handedly stopping dozens of tanks, but something more subtle and, in many ways, more significant, a case study in how wartime narratives form, evolve, and eventually detach themselves from their origins. Archival research confirmed the basic elements of the engagement. The German counterattack near Montorio was real. The terrain was a decisive factor. Allied infantry did hold the ridge through a combination of improvisation, communication, and sheer endurance. And Kowalski's improvised launchers were indeed used in the battle, with several documented hits that contributed meaningfully to halting the armored thrust. But the deeper researchers looked, the clearer it became that the famous number, 37 tanks destroyed, had no grounding in any official record. Unit logs, damage assessments, and post-battle technical analyses all pointed to a far smaller count, consistent with the initial reports filed by the sapper detachment itself. What fascinated historians was not the inflated figure, but the mechanism by which it had come to dominate the story. The process reflected the psychological pressures of the Italian campaign. Soldiers fighting along narrow mountain passes and fortified ridges often felt overshadowed by larger battles elsewhere. Victories were hard-won and frequently overshadowed by setbacks. News correspondents, constrained by censorship and the difficulty of gathering reliable information, tended to focus on narratives that emphasized resilience and inventive tactics. Once the exaggerated version of the Montorio fight entered the public sphere, it filled a narrative need. It offered an example of how ordinary soldiers, armed with ingenuity rather than advanced weaponry, could defy a formidable enemy. As post-war researchers interviewed veterans who had fought on the ridge, they found a wide range of recollections. Some remembered the improvised launcher clearly, recalling the tension of waiting for a tank to move into range. Others remembered only the smoke and confusion, unable to distinguish which weapons had hit which vehicles. A few admitted that, at the time, they themselves had believed the rumors of dozens of enemy tanks destroyed. After all, in the limited visibility of battle, with explosions echoing through the terraces, it was easy to assume that each plume of smoke marked another armored casualty. Memory, fragmented by stress and shaped by later retellings, had absorbed the legend into the lived experience of those who survived the battle. Kowalski, who emigrated after the war and pursued a quiet career in engineering, never embraced the myth that had grown around his creation. In the rare interviews he granted, he emphasized that his team's contribution was only one part of a much larger defensive effort. He spoke instead about the importance of adapting to shortages, the value of teamwork in high-pressure situations, and the reality that improvisation was often a necessity rather than a mark of genius. His perspective, modest and grounded in his wartime experience, eventually influenced later historical assessments, helping to reframe the Montorio story not as a tale of miraculous weaponry, but as an example of creative problem-solving during a difficult campaign. In academic studies of World War II propaganda and battlefield reporting, the Montorio incident is frequently cited as a case of narrative escalation, the process by which an event, initially notable but limited in scope, becomes enlarged through repetition, simplification, and the merging of multiple accounts. It illustrates how wartime communication, shaped by urgency and morale considerations, can blur the line between documentation and inspiration. At the same time, it shows how legends often emerge not from deliberate fabrication, but from the natural human tendency to fill in gaps, emphasize dramatic elements, and seek meaning in chaotic circumstances. Today, the facts of the Montorio battle are clearer than they have ever been, but the legend still persists in popular memory. It appears occasionally in documentaries, exhibits, and compilations of unusual weapons of the Second World War. Some versions lean toward the dramatic, others acknowledge the exaggeration. Yet even stripped of its inflated numbers, the story retains its historical value. It reminds us that the reality of war is rarely captured fully by headlines, that improvisation can play a crucial role in frontline survival, and that understanding the past requires careful attention to both the recorded facts and the narratives that formed around them. The true legacy of Kowalski's launcher lies not in the myth of the 37 tanks, but in what the episode reveals about the human dimension of the conflict, the creativity of soldiers under pressure, the evolution of wartime storytelling, and the ways in which fear, hope, and limited information can transform a tactical incident into a lasting legend. And in the end, the story of the worthless scrap metal launcher stands as a layered reminder of how World War II was fought not only with weapons and tactics, but also with memory, perception, and the powerful influence of narrative. The ridge above Montorio, quiet now except for the wind moving through the terraces, offers little visible trace of the confusion, determination, and improvisation that once defined it. Yet the events of that afternoon in May 1944 continue to echo through historical study because they reveal something essential about the nature of warfare. The outcomes that reach public consciousness are often shaped as much by the stories people tell as by the facts themselves. When researchers revisit the surviving documents of the battle, the sapper detachment's modest kill count, the artillery logs, the terrain sketches, the fragmented testimonies, they encounter a picture far more complex than the wartime headline suggested. They see a team of exhausted soldiers operating under extraordinary pressure, attempting to compensate for shortages with ingenuity. They see an improvised weapon whose effectiveness was real but limited, dependent on terrain conditions and teamwork. They see confusion born from smoke, echoing explosions, and the difficulty of identifying targets in mountainous terrain. They see how a single disrupted armored column could be interpreted, in the heat of battle, as something far larger, but beneath these factual reconstructions lies a deeper narrative, the way memory transforms reality. The Montorio story grew not because anyone intended to deceive, but because people under strain instinctively sought meaning in chaos. Soldiers repeated the most striking details. Journalists amplified the elements that would inspire readers. Civilians, searching for hope amid the uncertainty of 1944, embraced the idea that even the simplest tool could change the course of events. Over time, the exaggerations hardened into legend, and the legend, repeated often enough, began to seem like truth. For historians, the case underscores the importance of critical inquiry, examining sources carefully, distinguishing between primary evidence and later retellings, and acknowledging how perspective, fear, and the passage of time influence what is remembered. It also highlights the importance of humility when approaching the past. Not every record is complete, not every testimony aligns, and sometimes the most enduring stories are those that grew in the spaces left by incomplete information. Yet the Montorio story endures for reasons beyond its distortions. Beneath the layers of myth lies a genuine insight into the lived experience of the war. The improvised launcher symbolizes the resourcefulness that soldiers across all fronts depended upon. It represents the countless unsung adaptations, some successful, some not, that shaped countless engagements. It illustrates the ways small acts of innovation could matter, even if they did not reshape the battlefield on the scale newspapers later claimed. Today, the legend and the reality coexist. Museums occasionally display reconstructions of the launcher, noting both the mythic version and the verified historical account. Scholars use the story to teach about wartime reporting, propaganda, and the challenges of reconstructing battlefield events. And for those who study the human dimensions of conflict, the Montorio incident offers a striking example of how the pressures of war magnify the significance of individual actions. In the fullest sense, the legacy of the scrap metal launcher is not the fabricated number of tanks it supposedly destroyed, but the way its story illuminates the intersection of fact and narrative during one of the most turbulent periods of modern history. It reminds us that even small events can become symbolic touchstones, that legends often arise from kernels of truth, and that understanding the past requires both a careful reading of evidence and an awareness of how stories evolve. In this way, the final lesson of Montorio is both simple and enduring. History is shaped by what happened, but also by how people chose and needed to remember it.